So there are a lot of clever things that you can do right in a game of 40k, but today let's focus on the things that you can do wrong. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're going to focus on in-game battle commands, and focus on 5 of the most damaging mistakes that could cause you to lose a game instead of win one. Obviously we're going to be talking in fairly general terms, all armies do play a bit differently, and I'm sure a lot of this will be old news to the most experienced players. We'll go through each potential tactical error one by one, say why I think it's important, and of course if you can think of anything else important to add to the list, then please let us know down in the video comments. If you have enough good ideas, maybe there might be a part 2 in this video as well. So first up, I thought we'd start by something that seems fairly obvious. Don't get your models killed in your own turn if you can possibly avoid it. Generally it's expected that your army is going to be taking a bunch of damage in the opponent's turn, but there really are quite a lot of ways where your models can die during your turn, and generally it's all quite avoidable as you're the person in control, so it's usually your tactical errors that get them killed. Getting a unit killed in your turn rather than your opponent's just hands them a massive swing in the game, as well as having removed one of your damage dealing threats, it also means that the enemy units that would have had to go and kill that unit are now free to go after something else. Possibly one of the easiest ways to do this is overcommitting a charge to charging too many units at once. This was really quite a big deal when I played in that YouTube tournament recently. In 2 out of the 4 games, I had 2 really big hard-hitting assault units thrown at me. They tried to charge half my battle line, and because of the amount of the attacks they were taking in return, they got almost all of their models killed in their own turn. Obviously the balancing act can be a bit tricky, you want to engage, tie up and kill as many models as possible, but if you are charging units that can potentially hit you back quite hard, the absolute worst thing would be for your charging unit to get wiped out in return. Sometimes it might just be better to go for a lesser prize, thoroughly wipe out one enemy unit, and accept that your scary assault unit might well get robbed out enemy firepower in the following turn. Even that is better than them getting killed in assault though. For getting models killed in your own turn though, there's really quite a lot of other possibilities. You need to try and avoid intercept type mechanics and gotcha moments such as Auspex scan, or Eldar frying your reserves with Dark Reapers from half the battlefield away. Don't forget heroic intervention and put a unit that's too close to an enemy unit for them to heroic intervene into you and then kill a bunch of models that way. Many units have stratagems that can do that now, so it's worth being aware of that. Psychic powers always have the slim but terrible possibility of perils, so if a psychic power really isn't going to give you anything, there's no point in casting it at all. I had one particularly memorable occasion where I had an astropath try and cast Psychic Maelstrom where he really didn't need to, rolled a perils, promptly lost all his wounds and exploded, killing a nearby Imperial Knight that was down to 1 or 2 wounds left, and on top of that the Knight also exploded, showering the rest of my army in mortal wounds. Fortunately the game had already been going spectacularly well up to that point, so I still got the win, but just be aware of the dangers of casting with Psykers with very low wounds left. Generally speaking, if your Psyker doesn't have any other important powers to cast, then maybe just leave off and make sure that you're not eating perils for no reason whatsoever. Otherwise, Overwatch can be pretty nasty. If your opponent has something that's almost guaranteed to delete your charging unit, then just don't charge in the first place, or charge with something else that's expendable that can soak the Overwatch for the important unit to get in. Finally, certain enemy vehicles might be able to auto-explode or have a far better chance to explode, such as Imperial Knights. If you are planning on killing one of these critters that could do that, it's worth trying to drop back so you're not just losing loads of models to enemy explosions if you do down their vehicle. Generally speaking, unlike your opponent's turn, almost all of these are very avoidable with good play, so it really is a mistake if you lose too many important units to any of these. Next up, certainly an issue for newer players is mismanaging command points, and either spending them too frivolously or sitting on them all game until any chance of them being useful has passed. Generally the balance does tend to come with experience. Particularly people who are newer to the game tend to be sucked in by using CP for very minor damage buffs just because they can. Things like if you have a Razorback with a couple of las cannons and then it misses both of its shots, it's very tempting to reroll one of the hit rolls, even if rerolling hit rolls, even with powerful weapons, generally tends to be fairly low return on investment. You're generally best off rerolling damage results, such as when you roll a 1 on a d6 weapon. Generally with command points you need to assess whether a stratagem's really going to make all that much difference to the game, and weigh it up against other potentially more powerful moves that you might be able to do later. On the flip side, not using command points fast enough can also be a bad thing. Generally the first 3 turns tend to be the places that you want to spend the vast majority of your CP. with several players burning through almost their entire stack by the bottom of turn 2. The reason for this is that you want to gain an advantage early on in the game if possible, when the outcome is in more genuine question. Generally by turn 3 or 4, it looks fairly obvious which way the game might be going. Just in terms of raw damage dealing, it would make a lot more sense to invest your command points in getting, say, one enemy tank dead right at the very start of the game, as opposed to achieving the same thing right at the end of the game where it's already had 4 or 5 turns doing maximal damage. It's no good to you to have 12 command points available if you've been whittled down to just one character and a troops choice and you've already lost the game, no matter how many fancy stratagems you use on them. Generally with command points, best uses tend to be really big offensive or defensive or movement buffs, maybe things like Space Marine transhuman physiology, or being able to fall back and shoot and charge with a powerful unit. Using a command point to reroll charges is one of the best value ones in the game, as often the difference between a successful and failed charge is the difference as to whether or not you wipe out a whole enemy unit. Could be one command point very well spent, if you do manage to switch it around. Another one that's really potentially quite powerful is interrupting in melee. If you've been charged with a unit that could take some significant damage, then interrupting with one of your own fighter units can not only deal damage to the enemy, but is also likely to reduce the amount of damage that you're taking in return. Can be a good double effect there, and in the right circumstances is well worth a couple of CP, provided you do have something that's strong enough to hit with. Next up, I'd like to talk about gunnery command and splitting fire a bit too much. Again, this is certainly something that I've seen from time to time in newer players to the game, trying to divide their gunnery command and take down as much of the opponent's army as possible, and maybe just overestimating exactly what their weapons can achieve in one turn. For the vast majority of the time in 40k, it's usually better to fully destroy units than put some mediocre damage on several of them. Sure, it can make squads a little bit less threatening, or maybe make vehicles hit a little bit worse, but if you fully destroy a unit, then you've basically removed all options that your opponent could have had from that unit from the game. Obviously, damage can be really quite swingy in 40k, particularly with big heavy weapons such as las cannons or melter guns, but I think it counterintuitively often makes a lot more sense to go for a slight bit of overkill on each vehicle or unit that you're trying to kill. If you commit just the bare minimum to on average kill the tank, and there's a very good chance that you whiff and have to dedicate more firepower to it if you've got it, or just have to leave it for the opponent's next turn if you don't. I've had a game before where I had 3 Lehman Russ tank commanders, and because my opponent kept on wanting to fire single las cannons to try and finish off an injured one, it wound up living till the next turn, and dealing really quite a lot of damage to the enemy army. Sure, they got a few scattered wounds on each tank, but they would have been able to kill one if they just focused fire. Obviously, it doesn't make too much sense to go too far the other way. You don't really want to be just shooting at a 1-wound Lehman Russ with an entire Repulsor Executioner laser destroyer, but if that gun is the only thing that can actually finish off that tank, sometimes it might still not be the worst idea in the world. Gunnery command in 40k does seem to be a fair bit of risk management. Next up is one that's held true for virtually every edition of 40k, which is not to forget all about mission objectives purely to deal damage to the enemy army. Obviously you do need to balance the two of these in a game. If you can shut down or destroy the vast majority of the enemy army in the early turns, you're going to limit all of their abilities to score as well. But particularly with the way that Niantic scored, you do need to be trying to rack up points through the game, and later in the game destroying enemy units becomes less and less important in favour of trying to maximise those last objective points. For example, in turn 5 it doesn't really matter too much if you kill one enemy damage dealer. They've only got one more turn to destroy your units anyway, and it might just be better to go for objectives and hoover up some victory points. Generally it's a reasonable idea to have a bit of a game plan at the top of each turn. What objectives are you going to try and achieve to score this turn? Which units are going to try and do them? Or do you need a turn of just trying to focus down parts of the enemy army and just deal absolute maximum damage? In general, even for more experienced players, it can be very tempting just to go after exposed enemy units, even when sometimes it might not actually make that much sense. If you are really trying to win a tight game, then sometimes the most boring option of just staying put on an objective might be the best, even if it's with some sort of elite assault infantry units that really want to get stuck into the enemy army. Particularly in the last turn or two, you need to think about whether the death of your target would actually really translate into the enemy army scoring any fewer victory points, or stopping you from scoring any in return. Finally, I'd really try not to miss opportunities for where your units can really try and get in the enemy army's way, opportunities to screen enemy units, or block movement, or wrap and trap them in close combat. Now of course this could be much more or less important depending on what you're fighting. whether there's reserves, whether there's enemy slow moving big critters, or whether the enemy army is almost impossible to screen against, say like fast moving harlequins. But against a lot of armies where it is relevant, it can be pretty devastating. If your opponent is making really quite big use of deep strikers or strategic reserves, it's often really not that hard to zone out huge areas of the table where they're not able to drop. Every model basically generates a 9-inch bubble around it where you can't put any reserves, and even with fairly elite armies, if you really want to, you can usually zone out the vast majority of the board and force your opponent to try and drop those units in their own drop zone somewhere. Your units just need to be somewhere around about 18 inches away from each other so their bubbles overlap, and plonk a unit in each corner 9 inches away from the corners and zone out the edges as well. Often you're likely to have units all over the board anyway. By fiddling with their positions and just making sure that there aren't any glaring gaps, it could mean that enemy elite deep strikers are going to have to drop back in their deployment zone, making their whole deep strike maneuver kind of pointless in the first place. It's potentially even easier to achieve with strategic reserves, where you can push them back significantly just by sending a unit or two down each flank. Blocking movement and holding the enemy army back can be pretty powerful as well, and it's perhaps best with any really big vehicles or monsters that really want to be moving forward to get into your lines. Maybe things like big Tyrannid critters, Imperial Knights, or greater demons without wings could be good targets. Sometimes it can be really quite easy to hold these guys back if you have a depleted chaff unit, and often you can just park them in a gap between a couple of buildings, and the big scary model won't have any room to pass. They can't move directly over them, they can't move through terrain walls, and they can't even move within 1 inches of your models. Provided they're not infantry and their bases can't pass your models, then the unit isn't getting through, and the best they're going to achieve is to charge your chaff unit. Depending on the exact enemy army, this can be really quite punishing if you have any pre-game movers or a scout setting up in the midfield. In the right matchup, you could really delay the enemy battle plans by stopping them from getting anywhere near the rest of your army. Units like Cerberus Raiders, Nurglings, or Guardsmen with move could be pretty excellent at this. Far better to lose one of these chaff units and hold up a big threat like an Imperial Knight from getting anywhere near your lines. Finally, if you're fighting in melee, it often still makes sense to try and do a tri-point type maneuver on the opponent. That's the gamey maneuver where you take a model hostage by putting 3 of your own models in base contact with it at equal distance around it, so there's no room for it to fall back. If it's achievable, it still pretty much makes sense to do this after virtually every fight phase. Sure, the models could use that stratagem Desperate Breakout to have their models fall back, but that costs quite a lot of CP, and it means that the unit isn't going to be doing anything else that turn. For the most part, it's pretty much a free maneuver after you've fought, and it's only going to reduce the opponent's options. Generally though, if there's any way that your units can impede or hamper the enemy units and shut down their choices, it usually makes sense not to miss it. So anyway, hope that's raised a little bit of food for thought next time you're playing 40k. And as I said, if you think there's anything else that I might have mentioned in this one, please let me know down in the comments. Perhaps if there's enough ideas, then maybe we could do a part 2. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the 40k content coming every day. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, such as seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.